So welcome, everybody. First of all, great to see you all. This is a bigger crowd than last year, so I can tell that the world's general taste is greatly improved. So welcome to Brookline Booksmith's author event series. My name is Alex Schaffner. I'm the community engagement coordinator here at the Booksmith. It is my great privilege here tonight to be speaking with Rebecca Fraimow about her new novel, Lady Eve's Last Con. I actually think you should clap louder than that, so do it again. Wonderful work, everybody. Rebecca is an archivist and writer based here in Boston. Many of you have seen her before as a human individual in daily life. In my experience, she's an insatiably curious, thoughtful, and open-hearted student of everything she encounters, and I think this shows up very well in all of her writing, which is personal, clever, deeply considered, relentlessly funny, and very compassionate. Lady Eve follows her novella, The Iron Children, which is super cool, and a number of excellent short stories in publication, including Hugo long-listed short story, This Is New Gehestrin Calling. I'm sure some of this is true for some of you as well, but I'm lucky enough to have known Becca for a long time, and I've gotten to experience Lady Eve in various forms before its publication. Its last couple of iterations I did not see, so it's been a complete treat to dive into her final form, a rollicking, jolly screwball adventure in zero-gravity debutante parties, futuristic cocktails, artificial beaches, dubious technological advances. Don't put things in your brain and don't take things out. And a really hot lady rake / businesswoman. She was there the whole time, but I was still excited. This book slides between genres joyfully and feels like the result of broad reading that leads to a unique twist on all of it. If you haven't read the book yet, or at least not in its published form, you are in for a treat. Please welcome Rebecca. So congratulations, how's it been?
Wow, thank you. It's been pretty cool. I am pretty stoked about the whole thing.
Yeah, well this one, you didn't necessarily expect Lady Eve to ever make it into the world.
I absolutely didn't. This one had a long journey. This is actually, so I signed my agent with this book, and then it was on submission for about 2 years. And it was sort of on its very last legs of like, okay, we're gonna send it out to one last publishing house, and then we'll maybe put it to bed for a while. But then I sold my novella, The Iron Children, which is a completely different book with a completely different topics, genre, etc. And the editor who bought it then took a different position in their publishing house and passed it on to a new editor who had just joined, which I was a little bit nervous about. Because she hadn't bought the book, I didn't know if she would like it. But then it turned out that not only did she like The Iron Children, she also liked this book enough to give it a second lease on life. And so on its last gasp, let's just throw it and see what happens, it ended up taking the road to publication. So never give up, I guess. The moral of that story.
That's a good moral. I'm thinking never surrender, but that's just because I saw Galaxy Quest a lot of times at a formative age.
Yes, same.
So this is the journey of the book. Can you tell us a little bit about it? Like if you wanted us to go on a date with it, how would you introduce it?
I think my agent actually coined this term, which is femme fatale meets femme fatale, which I think is really good. It's a screwball rom-com set in space, which I started writing just for kicks. I'd been sort of stalled out on a much more serious book for a really long time. And I was like, I'm gonna write something that's very silly and fun and throw in all the tropes that I like just for me. And then shockingly, that's the one I could get to the end of a draft. So that's how this became the first full-length novel that I actually finished.
Can you introduce us very quickly to Saul and Ruthie?
Sure. So the protagonist of this, the main character of this book, the point of view character, the first person voice, is a small-time con artist. She and her sister ride around in spaceships, cheating at space cards, and gambling people out of their money. When the book begins, her sister has made the terrible mistake of falling in love with one of their marks, and it ended badly. So Ruthie has decided that it's time to go and get revenge by upping the stakes and taking on a whole new identity and going and conning him out of more money by convincing him that he wants to marry her and then backing out of the engagement in such a way that he has to pay up. Unfortunately, he also has a hot, overprotective older sister. She is sort of a black sheep of the family. She's someone who was sort of expected to inherit a lot of money and a lot of business, and due to convoluted circumstances, is not going to do either of those things and is sort of trying to find her way now that the place in society that she felt like she was going to fill, she can't do that anymore. And she's gotten in some trouble with some gangsters as a result, and that's where some of the actual plot. The kernel of this book was some elements of this plot and the title, the 1930s, The Lady Eve. It's a great film. And the heroine is a con artist, much like Ruthie in this book, who, gets her heart broken by a clueless rich goober and then completely remakes herself and makes him fall in love with her over again. But he's still an absolutely clueless rich goober. I'm very happy for them, but I walked out of that movie and I was like, I think this would be a little bit more fun for me if instead she then met someone who had slightly more, who was slightly more of an actual opponent for her schemes. And that's where this book came out.
I have seen this book so far shelved both in sci-fi and in romance. Everybody makes their choices. But I think it obviously has strong elements of both, and it follows some of the plot arcs of both. And so I don't want to know how it fits into those categories. I'm interested in how it squirms out of the hard rules for both.
Yes, I love, so in my day job, I'm an archivist. And that's relevant because I do a lot of work with metadata, which means trying to figure out what labels apply to things in such a way that people can find them in a way that's useful, while also understanding that no matter what categories you're set, there will always be something that exists in an edge space in between those categories. And I love those edge spaces, and I like to write in those edge spaces because as soon as I see a hard and set line for like a genre boundary, I'm like, oh, but that's really annoying. What can I break it down? So this book, I had a lot of fun with sort of taking the things I find most fun about sci-fi and romance, and being in both of those spaces meant that I didn't have to adhere to sort of any rules that I didn't want to adhere to. It also meant that's part of the reason that I was pretty sure this book was never going to sell. I've been happy to be proven wrong on that score.
Well, I think it also helps you break those boundaries that the screwball, the filmic screwball element is just as strong as the rom-com novel and the sci-fi caper. And so I think the fact that it's so built into every line of the book makes it easier to keep it hard to describe. Yes, got lost in that sentence, that's for sure. So, as you were saying, this is the first novel that you wrote from beginning to end. You have previously published a novella, you've published a fair amount of short fiction, and I'm wondering whether there are ways in which writing projects of different scale are actually similar, because I think we hear a lot about how they differ, and I'm interested in what you've found to be sort of a through line in all of your creative projects.
That's a really interesting question. In all of them, I'm a very linear writer no matter what I'm working on, so whether I'm writing something that is over 100,000 words, as in this case, or something that is at 5,000 words, I need to start at the beginning and go all the way to the end. And once I hit the end, that's when I figure out what I was really writing about, and then I go back and fix the beginning and the rest of the story. It takes a lot more time to do this with a novel, which is why it gets a little harder. Not really knowing necessarily what you're writing about until you're more than halfway through can be a little bit frustrating. But it's still a process that works really well for me. And I really enjoy the process of discovery of, like, the point when you sort of midway through whatever you're writing, when everything clicks. And it's like, okay, now I understand what I was working towards. It doesn't make any sense with the first couple thousand words, but I understand what I was doing with it, and now I'm going to go back and make it the way that it's supposed to be.
The setting of the book is the distant future, when we've made it off the planet, although not all of us, there's still planet to be had. But the language, the social structures, the sort of starting point of a lot of the fashion seems to draw from more than one historical moment, all of those moments well before 2024. So I'm wondering how you arrived at that sort of cocktail of historical influences and imagined it reoccurring in the future.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of those cases where I started out writing it just because it was fun. And then I was like, actually, I have to start building a world around this and sort of making this universe make sense to me. And I do think that we see over and over again things that are old come back around, come back into fashion, are reinterpreted in new ways such that they might not be recognizable exactly to the people who were interpreting them through the first time around. But I think it's really fun when you look at the ways in which, for example, people in the 19th century were trying to gesture at classical fashion or Tudor fashion.
Oh, and their obsession with medievalism.
Exactly.
Yes.
It's
Lady
so
of
fun to
Shalott.
see that happen.
This is the Lady of Shalott with jokes.
Exactly. So that was part of it. Is this idea that you have these, when you're writing science fiction, it's important to try and sort of think of things that are new and that are going to change. But also, I think the fun of writing science fiction set in our future is that you have the whole world of the past to draw on and sort of play with and make over in whatever ways you want and put together again in new and fun ways. So that's part of what I was doing with this book. And also, certainly a lot of this book has to do with conspicuous consumption and has to do with how people are, creating a visual lifestyle for themselves and kind of showing off their connections to one place or another, their connections to the planet they came from, their connections to different businesses far off in the stars, how much they can get imported, what their clothes are made of, and how much it costs to get that fabric there, and then how much fabric you can use. And so pulling on some of that as well is something that I was sort of thinking, whenever I put a clothing description in the book, I was trying really hard, especially on the second and third drafts, to make sure that at least in my head I was thinking about what it took to get the fabric there to make that outfit, and then what it was saying about the person who wore it.
That's really interesting, because one thing I wanted to talk to you about was your world building, because I've seen a lot of your stories, and I've seen your start to finish approach. I've never seen a giant codex of world building facts, which some people will create. So you have these lived in settings, but you're very light-handed with using your setting. So I'm wondering how much concrete backstory and material culture and history and so on do you have either written down or concretely in your head, and how much of it is just feeling your way and trying to be mindful as you do it?
It's very little written down concretely. I'll generally sort of, as I'm writing, I usually start with a kernel of an idea and I start with some characters. And then as I go, I'll write things that sort of occur to me to put them in at the time. And then I'll sort of figure out if that works to go on with or doesn't. And if it triggers something that builds the overall world, or that I think is important for me to remember going forward, I'll leave a little note for myself in the bottom of the draft to be like, oh, now I figured out what's going on with this. And the details that I sort of put in as I'm going on a first draft, on the second draft, some of them will stay in and some of them will change, and over time they sort of accumulate to make a world as I fill in the underlying logic behind them. But on the first draft, it's a lot of instinct. I have so much respect for people who build a world from the ground up and put the codex together and actually think everything out in advance. It's not a mode in which I can work at all, but I really, really
some of those
admire
people
it.
also don't finish the book. Well, that's fascinating, and it works really well, because I always feel that every one of your stories has a real sense of history and place. but it doesn't feel like you're rattling off facts. So I think what you're doing is working, that's what I'm trying to say, and I like hearing a bit more about it. Now, obviously, I want to talk about gender and sexuality because this is a gay book, and it's pride. So, one thing that I think is interesting is that we see Saul sidelined in her father's company, but it's because of her birth, her parentage, and not necessarily because of her gender, which is really interesting in a setting that takes so many cues from like debutante, ton, and 20s style societies. And we also see queer relationships that on page are sort of free of the burden of fear. So I just want to know sort of what you imagine for gender and queerness as you're working in this setting.
So when I think about the future, I have a lot of respect for people who choose to write in a space where we have reached a future where none of that matters. But I find it really difficult to imagine myself in such a space. What I can imagine is, and you know, this comes from the context in which I live, I can imagine a future in which, like, as in the world we have today, mores and customs change based on where you are and what your context is. So I have chosen, for my purposes, because I'm writing a gay romance and there's certain things that I want to focus on, made the setting in which this takes place one in which, queerness is known about, is not, is pretty accepted on a relatively small scale, but there are still limitations when you go to other places have different mores, other places have different customs, and other places, both for the better and for the worse. And I've tried to sort of seed that in, that my characters are living in a context that span, because this is a place specifically where a lot of, it's a way station, it has history as a way station, where a lot of people, sort of pause and use it as a stop before going further out to other places. Shipments of cargoes used to move through there, businesses are built there that have connections to a large number of other locations. A lot of things can happen in this place that wouldn't necessarily happen in other places, but because they don't necessarily happen in other places, that still has an impact on what happens in this place. So I think one of the things that I put in this book is that even though queer relationships happen frequently, are not necessarily frowned upon, most people don't necessarily engage in one for the long term or don't envision their future that way because they know that could have an impact on them if they want to go some other places where it's not as welcomed. And that's specifically an artifact of this location, which is a bit of a way station. And other locations in this world and in this setting, not just on a planet level, on a city level, on a neighborhood level, different people would feel different ways.
I was recently watching the new Reading Rainbow documentary, which is very lovely. You should check it out. It'll make you feel nice. But one thing it brings up, obviously, LeVar Burton was also in Star Trek, so it comes up the idea that Star Trek was the first time on TV that there was an imagined future where people of color existed and survived. And I think the queerness in your book is one example of people who didn't previously exist in space are there, but you do also have a lot of ethnic, national, and racial diversity. So a couple questions. The first one is more general and not about your book in particular, but what do you think that diversity or lack thereof in science fiction indicates about the present that produced it?
I think I think everything that you see in science fiction, and I include my book in that. I think I include every work of science fiction that's ever existed, says more about the moment that it's created and than about the possibilities of the future. And the same is true for historical fiction. Like every work of historical fiction says more about the moment that created it than about the past in a real way. So I do think that when you see an imagined future that is only full of white people, unless there is a clear reason or point that the author is trying to make, it says something about the way that author imagines their, well, either intentionally or unintentionally says something about the way that author imagines their world. Yeah, I guess I'll stop there. And
Sure. I think you're quite well read, so I think you probably have a pretty good awareness of what's being published in sci-fi right now. what do you think is happening in the imagined futures that we're creating right now, broadly? And do you think it is suggestive of good, bad, or medium things in our living environment? It can be all.
I mean, all is a great answer. I mean, we're living in a really exciting moment for science fiction. I think that's really true, where we are seeing imagined futures that were much narrower in scope, say 50 years ago. Like, those futures did exist 50 years ago. You could find them, but it was harder to find them. And now, you can find them, and they are being presented and promoted, but I do think that there are still some limitations in the way that they're being presented and promoted. I think that there are challenges to being able to write about both positive and negative futures is really important. Being able to for anyone to be able to imagine themselves in the future is very important. But also, I do think that there can be limitations when, say, people of color who would like to imagine a future that doesn't necessarily center around, who would like to write a book for the sake of writing a book about anybody, can get sort of limited by the publishing industry to writing specifically about their own experience in a way that doesn't apply to other people.
Yeah, there is I think certainly there's sort of a backlash again. I think the idea behind own voices is very powerful because it says underrepresented authorship needs to be represented and allowed to tell stories that have been previously hidden. But sort of the horrible snake of that is that sometimes what that turns into is if you possess any marginalized identity, you can speak strictly about that, and in doing so, you are representing that. And so you better do it right, and you better not do anything else. And that is being seen sort of as like what's saleable and what's acceptable, and in a way that is just as harmful as some of the issues that people were running into before. So I think that's sort of in alignment with what you're saying.
I think that there are many more lanes of imagination that people can walk down, but it is perhaps more difficult to walk outside of those lanes, or as difficult to walk outside of those lanes as it ever was.
I would love to talk about Ruthie and Jules as Jewish people, because, well, first of all, I want to start with your writing in general, because I can pretty much always feel the centrality and the impact of Jewishness on the way that you write. And I mean, this is definitely true when you're writing about like Russian Jews in Russia. It's true in this case with these two sisters who speak Yiddish, whose background is like very important to them, complicated and important to them. But I think it's even true in something like The Iron Children, where you're in a secondary world and there is no Judaism, but you still feel the impact of that, not just in the way that you structure religion or countries, but in sort of the mindsets that you bring to your characters. So I was wondering what aspects of that you feel frequently infuse your work, and in this book in particular.
Sure. I think one of the themes that I return to pretty frequently is I am a diasporic Jew, and that influences my identity pretty heavily in the way I think about the world. And the idea of diaspora and having, that sort of, the connection to a culture, but not necessarily one that refers to a space or a location associated with that, is something that I think is a theme in almost everything I've ever written. And whether that's, you brought up The Iron Children, I think that's something that comes through really in that book, is the ways that different people can relate to that heritage, the way it can be something really positive, something really negative or really ambivalent, and that sort of comes through as a touchstone. And that is something that, in this book, I made a couple of specific choices that were really important to me in this book in particular. Ruthie and Jules are culturally Jewish in that they have absorbed some of that from their mother, who came from a much more religious background. They don't necessarily know what that means for them or how to feel about it. They know that they have these bits of culture that they've sort of brought through with them, that they use when it's useful, or it forms a bond between them as two people who travel in a variety of spaces that aren't necessarily friendly to them. But throughout the book, I think Ruthie is still figuring out what that means to her beyond those elements that infuse her life. And certainly that's true for me, and it's true for a lot of people I know. And again, talking about own voices, when I wrote this book in 2016, it was really important for me to write a Jewish future that focused on Jews of color and people who were of Jewish heritage that weren't necessarily white, that had an experience that was also inflected by that, because I didn't want to just imagine the white Ashkenazi Jewish future that is something that people think about frequently when they think about Judaism. And then I second-guessed myself a lot in the subsequent years as conversations changed around who should write what voices. And I'm still not entirely sure. Obviously I had a wonderful sensitivity reader for this book. And I stand by the choice that I made, and I did it with a lot of thought in it. That doesn't necessarily mean that I've succeeded in all aspects of it.
Thank you. Going in a completely different direction, I have a two-pronged question. It's related. First of all, this is more openly comedic than a lot of your other writing. So, were you allowed to keep a higher percentage of puns?
I actually was really restrained in the number of puns that I put in this book.
I don't believe you.
There aren't that many. Most of the humor is not pun related.
That is actually true. That was a cheap question. But relatedly, I don't know who was here last year, but you may or may not recall that there was a question about what titles the Iron Children didn't have, many of which were pun related. And I wonder if you can recall any Lady Eve titles that didn't make it onto the cover.
Oh my god, I had a whole list, and now I can't remember any of them. The working title for this book was Luck Be a Lady, because one of the other founding influences of this book, just in terms of vibes, are the Guys and Dolls musical. At one point, this is not a spoiler, but the ending doesn't do this anymore, but at one point the ending did revolve around a high-stakes card game. And then I went on when I was trying to find an alternate title, because it turns out that there are already several books that are titled Like Be a Lady, inconveniently for me. And I went on a long spiral of looking up titles of screwball comedies and trying to make them refer to space. And there were a lot of horrible puns in there, and I've now forgotten all of them, and that's probably for the best.
It's not. Well, if you find them, post them on the internet.
I will. That'll be my homework for after this, is all of the rejected titles, and there were so many.
So I wish I could remember some of them.
Yeah, you came up with some of them, and you came up with some of the worst pun offenders.
Oh. Well, in that case, let's not find them again. Then I will. It's not because I'm ashamed of puns, okay? It's because I will read the puns and realize that I have the best titles. Which your editor did not agree with. Because I think you presented some of them and she said no.
There was a long conversation about a title for this book. It was a process.
So Ruthie is a con woman, and you read all kinds of things and you watch all kinds of things. And I wouldn't ask this of everyone, but I would dare to ask you, do you have a favorite con artist?
So I am going to shout out, I don't know if this is my favorite con artist in all of fiction, but another book...
It can be a real con artist. It can be Neil Caffrey, who's the realest con artist.
I have actually never seen an episode of White Collar.
Just don't watch. You're fine as long as you don't watch like the last 3. Lots of not laughs here, but I agree strongly with what I've just said.
I have seen a lot of episodes of Leverage. But that's the fictional con artist that most inflected this book. There's an amazing romance novel by Rose Lerner called True Pretenses, which is a historical fiction book about a Jewish con artist who's trying to marry his little brother off to a rich woman, But then the little brother is like, no, actually, and leaves, and they have no choice but to get marriage of convenience to each other, and find out that being a rich Regency political hostess is quite a lot like being a con artist, and that you have to tell a lot of lies to people and project a lot of false faces. I love that book a lot. I didn't realize how much of it went into this book until I'd finished writing it, and I was like, oh, yeah, okay.
Can you say the name and the author again?
Yes, it's called True Pretenses by Rose Lerner.
Lovely, thank you. So we've covered the screwball comedies, we've covered the romance. Is there any other reading you've done over the past decade that has deeply impacted this book?
Yes. One of the, I prepared for this question this time, so you caught me off guard last time. Definitely Lois McMaster Butehold's whole over, but especially the screwball comedy in the Miles Borkosigan book.
Yes.
Which I have now completely forgotten the title of, despite Civil Campaign.
Yes, Civil Campaign.
Which was the first Butehold book I ever read. Like, I pulled it off a library shelf from the middle of that series, and it is maybe the first sci-fi screwball comedy that I ever read. And it has lingered in my psyche from that day to this, to the point where I kept sort of accidentally putting bits of world building from the Butehold, I don't know if you remember this, into drafts of this book. And I would put them into the book, and you'd be like, what does that mean? My whole group would be like, what does that mean? I'd be like, doesn't everyone know? Hasn't everyone read these books?
They had not, although I did read that one. But you put some of the ideas around...
I put some of the ideas around the production, specifically.
Yes, exactly.
Butehold has put a lot of thought in the 80s and 90s into how people might handle pregnancy and reproduction in the future. And I was like, oh, that makes sense, because I read it when I was 12, and then I just kind of took it. Despite the fact that that was the 90s, and things have maybe changed since then. Another work that I actually stole from, straight up.
You shouldn't say that on the live stream.
No, it's fine. This was nonfiction research. I read a book called Fortune Cookie Chronicles about Chinese cuisine in America, which is really fun. It's about sort of the development of American Chinese food as its own, distinct cuisine. But there's a chapter in there about, of course, the marriage of Jewish culture and Chinese culture in the ubiquitous kosher Chinese restaurant, that specifically talks about the Great Kosher Duck Scandal in Washington, D.C. in the 1980s, when a restaurant was found to be selling fake kosher duck that had not been properly and appropriately sourced. And I was like, this is extremely funny, and I have to put that in something. So that is why there is a kosher duck-related subplot in this book.
I would say that both in science fiction and romance, it's pretty normal to start with one book that stands beautifully on its own, and then to discover you have written an entire additional book about another of the characters. And I'm not telling you have to do this. However, I am interested in whether you've had any thoughts about giving an entire book specifically to Jules. And actually, if you wanted to give one to Esteban, he's a fool, but I would like to see him grow.
I have had thoughts in both these directions, actually. I have a pretty strong idea for a book about Jules if I get to write it. We will see. It depends on whether people like this one very much. But I would like to set a book about Jules on Earth and take a look at Earth as it exists 200 or 300 years in the future in this setting, in an era that has been sort of impacted by climate change and by the growth of this sort of big off-world culture and intergalactic travel, and spend a little bit more time there and out of the sort of very glitterazzi world that's the space of this book. And also spend some more time, maybe do a casino heist. So that is, if I write Jules' book, I have a pretty solid idea for that one. But I also have had thoughts about how Esteban might get a chance to grow. And I've had thoughts about Luann as well.
Yes.
So, we'll see. This is still the only full-length novel draft I've ever finished, so hopefully we'll get there.
Well, I want to leave plenty of time for the audience to ask questions, so thank you for answering mine. And now, raise your hands. Do it.
Sorry, the question was in my head, and it's still partially there. Reconstructed. You mentioned the Lady Eve a lot as like a touch point, and I wanted to ask about other screwball comedies that may have influenced you, because obviously the Lady Eve is a great movie, but you know, it has its own genre conventions. The screwball comedy has its own approach to things. So I wondered, you talked about escaping sci-fi and romance genres and their rules. How did you deal with the rules of the screwball comedy?
The thing that's great about screwball comedy is you can set up situations where everyone involved thinks it's a really good idea at the time, and then due to a small factor, things rapidly start to snowball out of control. And I had a lot of fun with that. So in this book, in space, it's very easy for things to snowball out of control, because if you're on a satellite or on a spaceship, you're sort of technologically dependent, and something breaks and then the gravity isn't working, and then everything is upside down and you're in chaos. So applying screwball comedy rules in that way of just like you break a little thing and then kind of start seeing what bounces off each other to create more chaos until suddenly you have a giant collapsing dinosaur skeleton. I don't have a giant collapsing dinosaur skeleton in this book. That was a reference to Bringing Up Baby, which is a great screwball comedy, but that same principle is really fun. And the other thing that I think is really important about screwball comedy romance that's fun to do is the way that arc generally works is you put people in positions against each other where they sort of have opposite interests or opposite attitudes towards life, and then let them bounce against each other until they realize that they have something to learn from the other person's attitude towards life, or the way that they go about their life that maybe would enrich your own life and sort of let you become a more vibrant person of your own accord. And so that is definitely something that I try and bring when I'm writing a romance, is that it's sort of, the connection between two people is one thing, but the ability to sort of figure out the ways in which you are not the person that you would like to be, and that you can become the person that you would like to be by being a little bit more open to chaos is, I think, a great screwball principle that I love very much.
Hi, so one of my favorite conventions for like sci-fi, science, space opera stuff is when things just become automatically space, like space cards or like space beams or something like that. I was wondering if, as you were building the world for this, you had a favorite sort of non-space thing that you were able to take and make more, either more space or more into the world that you've created.
Yes. Like I said, I did a lot with we can control gravity now. Don't ask me how, I'm not a physicist, but we can. And you might be in all different kinds of gravity environments. So we can do weird anti-gravity theater stuff. And then everyone has to be in a little floating box to get different parts of the view, because why not? But actually my favorite is that at one point they go to my heroine goes to a hair salon where they just switch the gravity to different levels throughout while you're getting your haircut, so you can see how it looks in every situation that you might be in. And then, it switches unexpectedly, someone maybe falls off a chair, but no. I leaned on that one very hard.
So, I just started reading Left Hand of Darkness for the first time ever, and so Ursula Le Guin talks in the beginning of that about how it's really about now, and it's, telling lies about the future. So I was very interested in what you were saying about how science fiction is really about our present. So beyond who is pictured and some of what you were saying about queerness, I was wondering if there's anything else you could share about what you felt you were saying about the present moment in this book.
Sure. And I think that maybe is, so like I said, I wrote the first draft of this book in 2016 and 2017, and things in our world have changed a lot since then. So as I was, when I was writing the first draft, my feelings about things like artificial intelligence, for example, changed a lot between 2016 and 2024, and things that I'd sort of thrown in as little references in the first draft where it was just silly. I'm I have to think a little bit more through the implications of that now. Or casually, like I'd put some like casual, like self-driving cars with their own intelligence in 2016, and I was like, I think I'm gonna change that for the 2024 draft. Certainly a theme that something that I've always kind of that I've been interested in since 2016 is wealth inequity, and like I said, conspicuous consumption, the way we use resources, the way we don't think about the resources we use, and I think that this is a very early 2020s book in the way it or I hope that it's in a way that it's an early 2020s book in the way that it thinks about those concerns. But it is wild reading something that you wrote, that you started writing 8 years ago and being like, oh, I have to say something different about this now because the way in which we think about it, the way in which I think about it, the sort of casual implications of the way we imagine the world have changed.
Can you talk about the development of the anti-grav opera and how you thought?
Yeah.
I
I love writing about theater. I love thinking about theater. If I had my way, this book would have a lot more theater in it. But I love just thinking about how you would have different theatrical conventions in the future and like trying to imagine something that doesn't just look like doesn't just look like our contemporary television series, doesn't just look like our contemporary Broadway shows. Making it anti-gravity and having, like sort of a weird it was one very easy way to lean on that, but something else that I did in addition to the anti-grav opera was when I was thinking about, like, media is not a big part of this book other than the trendy fancy theater bits. For the fact that this is a culture that does a lot of conspicuous consumption, and in many societies going to the theater and being seen at the theater is a status symbol. But when I was thinking about sort of casual entertainment in a world where people are traveling to different planets and different stations, data probably doesn't move in the same way that it does here on Earth, where we can all move around one planet, and probably you're going to be thinking in mass entertainment about smaller data packets. So I actually, when I was thinking about what mass entertainment people would be using, I went back to sort of audio dramas and serial plays of that nature rather than television or like Marvel films or whatever, because I was trying to sort of think about something that would still be recognizably mass entertainment, but not exactly the same as what we're doing now.
So you just mentioned how some things in the story change based on things that have been happening in the real world and change your perspectives on it. Did at any point that go the opposite direction? Like in world building something out, it kind of changed your perspective about something happening in the real world?
That's a really good question. I'm trying to think whether that was the case. I don't have an immediate answer for that, but I will keep thinking about it. And I will do my homework and try and come up with something, because I'm sure that there was.
So this is a first-person novel, and it's got a really strong, really fun voice, and a lot of stuff you've written has been first-person, very strong voice, very distinct voices. Can you talk a little bit about like either what were your touchstones for Ruthie's voice in specific, or like how you think about coming up with a strong narrative voice for like this specific character or story?
Strong first-person voice, like writing in first person is such a cheat code for me, because it's very easy for me to sort of create a distinctive character if I'm writing in first person, and I'm just like, all right, this is how they speak, this is how they talk, they're gonna lean into some of these particular idioms. They are going to, when they use a metaphor, they're going to use a metaphor that's relevant to their life and how they've lived. I had so much trouble in the first paragraph because originally, I think I used a metaphor in the first draft that was like, money falling into my hands like leaves from a tree. And then I was like, wait, this person has never lived on a planet. I have to come up with leaves in a brainstorm. I think it was like, if this doesn't work, I have to come up with something that's relevant to their life experience. But it is really easy and fun for me to just kind of slip into a voice and do that voice. A much harder trick, I think, is distinguishing third-person voices. If you've read The Iron Children, which is my first novella, That one's actually written in 2 third-person voices and a first-person voice because I didn't trust myself to distinguish 3 third-person voices, and I was like, I can make this voice really different and distinct if I make it first-person. On the other hand, there is, a trap of making first-person voices, if they come from kind of the same culture, sound the same because you're leaning on the same tricks. So I know that's something that my crypto has called me out on a couple of times in writing my,
I like that you pointed directly to me.
my crit group is that I tend to slip into the same voice for all of my Utica stories, which are set in the Pale of Settlement at the turn of the century, even though they're narrated by different people. So I do have to make sure to distinguish those voices in a certain way and make sure that those narrators feel like different people, even though they're using the same kind of idioms and the same kind of writing tricks. And if I ever do write the book about Jules, the sister from this book, I think that it is going to be harder than it was to write this book to make sure that Jules feels like a distinct voice, even though I'm using some of the same, idioms and some of the same style for the setting.
What happened to the card game?
I sent, so the card game was in the very first draft, and through discussions with my agent, it was like, well, it's kind of low stakes and doesn't pull in as much, even though it was a high stakes card game. Pull in as many of the various different strands of plot as it needed to be like a big finale, so the card game had to go.
And what replaced it?
I can't tell you that, that's a spoiler. I'll tell you later.
I was interested in some of your points around how characters perceive themselves and even people who you would say objectively not being a good or nice person think of themselves differently. And just the sort of themes of like what is kindness and what is being just sort of socially nice versus legitimately kind. Is this like an intentional theme? Is this just an outgrowth of like what the characters' voices are like?
It's definitely an intentional theme, and it's also like, if you're gonna write a first-person voice, I always think a first-person narrator should be a little bit unreliable. Like, you cannot trust one person's perceptions of the world. They are seeing the world through a particular filter. There are people that Ruthie feels very strongly about that someone else might feel a completely different way about, and I hope that there are hints in this book that Ruthie's perceptions of these various characters are limited and biased, and certainly not the same as what other people's perceptions of them are when they encounter them in different spaces.
Esteban book.
And so, this is in many ways a book about perceptions, about, sort of how you present yourself to the world, a book about being a con artist, about being the kind of con artist who does social cons and goes on and pretends to be somebody different. In a very real way, I think has to, or at least, should be about the difference between what's on the outside and what's on the inside, and the different sort of ways those can impact the self, and how you can be a different person in different contexts and present different sides of yourself to different people. So I hope that's a theme in the book, and I hope it comes through.
One more if we've got one more.
In the Iron Shelter, you described that point where you use third person for 2 of the characters and one first person for the third one. I was curious for this book. I think of that as being it's one of those big. It was kind of breaking conventions that authors often do. Do you feel that there's specific writing conventions that you were willing to break that not to say it's completely novel, but that might go against what's usually done in terms of the actual mechanics of the writing?
So actually just keeping to one voice for the entirety of this book is a little bit out of convention for contemporary romance, or for romances being written in this particular moment, in this, at least in the US, where the convention is much more to have 2 POVs and sort of jump between them so that you can see what both people are thinking. And again, sort of back to what you were saying, Sandri, I really wanted this to be a limited perspective, and one person's view of the world. And that was a deliberate choice that is I think more common for sci-fi than for romance, and that's sort of one of those places where straddling genres allowed me a little bit more flexibility.
All right, I think that brings us to the end of our time. Thank you for all of your wonderful questions, and thank you for being here tonight. Another round of applause for our wonderful